All right,
Yes.
well, we're going to get started. So here we go. Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us at this Merkle webinar. Crypto regulatory trends, sanctions, and emerging risk. That's what we're talking about this morning. I got three great panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. My name is Robert Whitaker. I'm a former HSI supervisory agent. Done a few things in my life, but I'm here now doing this moderation. So I have Manfred, David, and Alex on the call with me this morning. Pleasure to have all you. So let's get started. David, I'm gonna start with you because you're on this side of my screen. If you want to introduce yourself, then we'll go to Manfred and Alex, and then we'll kick this thing off.
Sure, happy to. Well, thanks everybody, and good morning where I am. Good day wherever you may be. Dave Hirsch. I'm a partner at the law firm McGuire Woods LLP. Been here only a few months. Before that, I was at the SEC for almost 9 years, most recently as the chief of the crypto assets and cyber unit in a division of enforcement. I took that job about a month before FTX collapsed, so I thought the job was going to be one thing, and then it was that thing plus a lot of other things. Certainly exciting, and look forward to having a chance to talk with you all about it today. Before that role, I had spent 2 years as counsel to Commissioner Caroline Crenshaw, also at the SEC, and so had an opportunity to step out of an enforcement role and think about more policy-directed issues as it applies to crypto and cyber. Looking forward to the discussion today.
All right.
Good, Manfred.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Manfred Beckrist here, Chief Compliance Officer at Paxful for the last 6 months. Prior to that, worked with Crypto.com and OKX, so about the last 4 years of crypto. And before that, a decade in more traditional finance and money service businesses like Western Union, TransferGo, and in the regulatory licensing game in Europe for quite a while there. So really focusing on elements like operationalizing the compliance elements that come down the pipeline from administration. So really getting people up and running.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me today. My name's Alex. Great to meet you all. I lead our transaction monitoring program here at Binance, the world's largest exchange by volume. I've been working at Binance for about the last 2 years in this role, leading on-chain transaction screening and our off-chain transaction monitoring program. Prior to this, I worked at Kraken for a number of years in similar investigations roles, most lately as its incident response lead. So primarily leading a team of investigators responding to large incidents in the space, including hacks, stolen funds, all that very exciting stuff.
I bet your life is exciting with Binance. A lot of things going, a lot of business over there, right? A lot of things going on all day, every
Certainly
day.
things are busy these days, yes.
I bet they are. So let's just jump right in here. I have a whole series of questions, gentlemen. We're not going to get through all of them, but we did take a look at all of these prior to this webinar. I've kind of broken up to who I think might be the most interested in answering these. So I'm going to start off with Manfred this morning on the first question. And Manfred, I apologize for smacking you with this, but the big dog in the room, the question everyone wants to know, at least in the U.S. and probably more globally, because the U.S. kind of leads the market anyway. I don't know about everything else, but we'll leave it at that. What potential changes, if any, can we anticipate crypto policy under this new administration? What do you think is going to happen with crypto in the United States and globally?
Well, let's start with the United States. So, I mean, the ethos of the conservative Republican side of things in history has been to deregulate, right, and promote economic growth. And let's say the economic stimulus that has happened since November election here, you can see it globally. Everyone's excited what's going to happen, and we're going to see what the new year holds and what actually happens after the 20th of January. So that's the expectation. The reality is, of course, much more complicated. Small margins in Congress, small margins in the Senate. And I think, everyone's still reeling after FTX and everything else, and the consumer protection elements that came to light. All the things that drive policy is usually everything that happens wrong. People are very quick to react to bad things and very slow to actually set frameworks up front. You have a lot of stuff happening globally and in places where it's much easier to push policy forward than it is in a place like United States, where you have 50 states and then the federal government. You can't really enforce things federally too much and then have it apply. You know, Europe's done a lot of great things in terms of unifying under directives. The PSD environments really drove a lot of innovation in the fintech space. That US is still struggling a little bit because, hey, you know, you're stuck in the MTL world, money transmitter. You're really money transmitter. It doesn't really fit your mold. You're in NMLS, which is a mortgage system for registration and everything else. So it's a very, very hard place to manage things and gets very expensive through how it's done. So any type of regulation that can, at a federal level, that can be applied throughout the states is great. You know, some states have taken a very clear stance that they want to lead it. New York, California is following suit. You know, so other states can sometimes, if you can't do better, you copy. So maybe that's going to be the standard. Who knows? We don't know for sure. Of course, the administration has set very clear goals in terms of competing with China and EU, and being competitive and bringing, you know, Bitcoin and innovation back to the United States. So that's encouraging. However, you know, in practice, which elements are going to be pulled from the existing frameworks? Because we know what works, and we very well know the things that don't work. Because at the best case scenario, we get clear policy and saying like, this is how you do things. At worst of the best, you get guidance of how to arrive to that decision yourself. At this point in the United States, we really have neither. We can just go based on past enforcement action. So again, no answer here, but the trend is towards that. Hopefully things that will help innovation, not hinder it as it's been in the past.
Yeah, you know, just your answer spurs a lot of thoughts and additional questions, but we'll save those for later. I'm gonna give David a chance to chime in, and Alex, I'll give you a chance to chime in and address that, and then we'll jump on to the next question. David, what do you think about what is going to happen here?
Well, I agree broadly with what Manfred laid out. I think that certainly directionally, it's clear that it's going to be a more open and permissive environment for crypto. I think it's great for innovation. I think the consumer protection issues loom large, and trying to find that right balance has been a struggle. Someone who worked in government and thought about those issues a lot. It's challenging, and for our international audience, it's particularly challenging in the US because I think almost uniquely around the globe, we have separated out securities and commodities under two separate regulators, under two separate sets of overseers in the Congress and in the Senate. And so there are a lot of interested parties who have good ideas, but those ideas aren't always super compatible, and trying to figure out how to provide the resources necessary to allow more conduct to occur in a safe way that's both good for markets and investors, but also good for innovators and developers. Like it's challenging, and I think it likely won't be fast. I know there's a lot of optimism that we can get in quickly with a new administration and things will change. Having been at the SEC for a long time, that's not traditionally how things work there. It's very deliberative, it's very process-based. And I think there's concern on the part of regulators that if they do something that is too fast or too dramatic, it could disrupt the regulatory structure that has been generally effective for the $120 trillion traditional finance markets that are also their responsibility. And so it'd be great to get direction from Congress to say this is what we want to do, and then leave it to the SEC and the CFTC to figure out how to implement it. That's traditionally how financial regulation works. Additional complications, again, for our international audience, the US rulemaking process is governed by the Administrative Procedures Act, which is, again, very detail oriented, very process based, can take up to 2 years, subject to court challenges. And a little unclear to me that if that is the route that the SEC and CFTC end up going down for an Administrative Procedure Act rulemaking, what happens during the 2 years while that process unfolds? Is that like a stepping away from current jurisdiction and kind of the registration first focus that the last administration had? Is it just looking at fraud? That seems like an area of great consensus. The Republican and Democrat appointed commissioners all agree that fraud and crypto are bad, and all vote for those enforcement actions uniformly. I can say, as somebody who did frontline investigations, it can be really challenging if you don't have some constant touch points with that entity to be able to discern fraud from the outside. Like the registration process in the US and other markets has made it easier to detect and prevent fraud early, because there are oversight kind of loops that are built into that process in a way that if you're just, we only come after you once we've identified fraud, typically you're coming in after the house is already burned down, and that causes a lot of harm and dislocation for investors. So very interested to hear your views, Alex, as well.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
Alex,
Dave. Yeah, sorry, Robert. I think
go
Dave
ahead,
makes
take a
a
crack
really
at it.
interesting point. I think implementation is certainly the most interesting part, right? The spirit, I think we can all agree, seems positive throughout the space. And I think we can all agree that regulation is a good thing for the industry, where markets love certainty, and where we have certainty, regulation certainly brings that certainty. And so the spirit is promising and exciting. The uplift is exciting. I think everyone at the Indian industry is excited for the direction that not only the US is heading in, but the globe as well. However, I think implementation and how companies are expected to comply with new regulation is really the most interesting part. And that certainly remains to be seen. New policy at this point still hasn't really come into force yet. So I think I'm hesitant to express my enthusiasm until we really get to that point. However, I think the new administration is certainly positive for the industry.
Yeah, excellent. Well, gentlemen, I can tell you that just your answers alone spur a lot of more questions. We could probably spend all day on this one section right here, but we're going to move forward just a little bit. We're still going to talk about regulation, but I'm going to pitch the question out to David or Manfred, whatever one of you want to jump in on it. But how do global regulatory developments such as MiCAR, UAE regulations, Hong Kong stablecoin proposals? Stablecoins are huge in this world right now, and I think they're just going to get bigger. So that's a big one right there. How does that influence U.S. regulatory approach? Are we going to see some adoption of what we see going around the world, or is the U.S. going to go full bore on its own again?
Dave, I can start if you don't mind. So I think, as I alluded to in my first answer there are governments that are much more streamlined in the world that have taken quick action to understand what the products and the crypto situations are, and then put a framework for it. The concepts within crypto are not that novel, and the most common ones are pretty clear. So what is Bitcoin, how it works, what the exchanges look like, not that much different from the traditional exchanges, just another asset, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the rules probably already exist in some way, shape, or form. Of course, for anyone who's tried to apply travel rules to crypto, and can understand that old rules doesn't necessarily apply very well to a crypto world, but trying to adopt that instead of enforce the past rule, but actually change the rule so it meets the technology, because technology always evolves much faster than the laws do. And laws that are very prescriptive, like in some European countries, those countries end up falling behind because they force it just this way rather than making a kind of like a blanket law, and then give the enforcement bodies, like David said, SEC and others, to enforce it and issue subsequent guidance within that framework. So MiCA and all the regulations from that are pretty clear. Hey, we want to make crypto companies and the VASPs, now the CASPs, into a regulated way that we had previously with electronic money institutions, and focusing on safeguarding funds, making sure that the money is safe once it enters the clouds of internet, reporting, showing that you're holding those funds. Same thing with, similarly, I guess, with the UAE sandbox environment that gives you almost like a free pass experiment. Safely, we'll watch it, we'll let you, but you are in this sandbox environment, so innovate. Show me that you know what you're doing and you're solving actual problems. That's a really nice thing to do for companies to drive that innovation, because you're not as worried about enforcement just because you haven't applied a 1994 law to your crypto business. Further to the Hong Kong situation and the stable coins. And those things, again, stablecoin is very clear in its offering, right? The only thing is how's it audited, and how are you proving that the money's there in the stable currency that it's tied to. And that's a pretty simple, straightforward thing. Of course, audits and everything else and reporting needs to be there, but the framework that takes in that information and validates it is, very early. But again, it's very simple concepts if you really break them down. There are a lot of great YouTube pages that do it in like whiteboard crypto, I'll call them out. I send some, newbies in the crypto world and analysts to just look at those elements, because it's not very complex. It gets complex in the blockchain world and how the smart contracts, everything else. But just like the general concepts that we're trying to regulate are pretty straightforward. So a lot of examples around the world that US can take from, and you can pick and choose. You can see what's worked. You can see the complaints really quickly about the things that aren't.
Yeah, very true. David, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think to some extent there had been some reluctance internationally to set out new rules in the hopes that the US was going to come forward and set a kind of a national and then maybe international standard. And only when that became clear was not going to happen on a short time horizon that other governments decided that they needed to try and do their best to lay out what would be appropriate for their domestic audiences. But I mean, crypto is international, so even when you're thinking about domestic, you're also thinking about international. I mean, I think agree again with Manfred. A lot of the experimentation and new rules that are going on make a ton of sense, and I think work well for those jurisdictions. I think they're challenging to port over whole cloth to the US, again, because of that commodity security divergence we have here. That means when our regulators and our companies that are regulated start to figure out what rules they have to follow, they first have to define what it is they're talking about. Are they talking about a security or a commodity? Neither is necessarily a perfect fit for crypto. And so that makes it extra challenging, and we'll have to see how that ends up getting applied. I think stablecoin legislation in the US is very possible. I think it would likely follow some of the successes that we're seeing internationally with some of the other regulatory regimes that are cropping up. I do think for stablecoins, particularly, a prudential regulator or regulatory scheme makes the most sense. Like, my biggest concern with stablecoins is if there's a problem and like a bank run occurs, and there you want to have a financial regulator in place who has the authority to come in, freeze assets, figure out what's happening, appoint a receiver, and make sure that people get all or as much as possible of their money back. That's not a role the SEC has traditionally played. They are kind of a financial regulator, but not a prudential regulator. They don't have those types of authorities. And so I'd be interested to see some other regulator that has more opportunities and experience with cleanup to have the kind of lead role for stablecoins in the US.
Yeah, very, very good. Alex, you want to retort on that?
I think all agreement on my side, really. I think compatibility, to Manfred's point, will be especially interesting, where, because to David's idea, the US is kind of coming in at the very end of the party to a certain degree. At this point, compatibility will be an interesting idea moving forward, where the US now has this idea that they don't want to be behind the eight ball when it comes to the industry. And so introducing new legislation, introducing new laws when it comes to stablecoin adoption and VASPs in general, if you introduce a regime that is either inherently incompatible or too onerous compared to other, more international regulators, international laws, you risk alienating that industry. You risk having offshore companies value other, jurisdictions more so than, the US. And I feel like that's a great fear. And so realistically, that thought is going to be at the forefront. How do we remain compatible with what is already in place or going to be in place in other countries while still ensuring that regulations are rigorous? I'm not sure what that will look like, but I'm sure that's top of mind when we talk about these kinds of things.
Yeah, very interesting, gentlemen. I do have a question. It's slightly off script, but we've talked a lot about the CFTC and SEC and the U.S. Congress and getting things done. And this is totally off script, so just please be brief if you feel like it's worth answering. The recent Supreme Court ruling taking some teeth out of the Chevron deference, is that going to affect how Congress is able to? Are they really got to drill down and spell out what they're talking about, or is this going to be something that they have to pass on for rulemaking later? Just pass on a broad law and say, figure it out, guys. I think David's probably the best to answer that one.
Yeah. I'm happy to take that. I know the SEC is thinking hard about that as they think about what types of rulemaking they may have. I know Congress is also thinking carefully about it. It's not exactly clear how that will be applied going forward, other than that courts will have more authority to apply their own experience and logic to disputes that come before them. And so they're not going to necessarily need to rely on the expertise of an agency to tell them how this rule should be interpreted, even if there's a rule the agency drafted. The other Supreme Court case that's, I think, important is Loper Bright, which was another Supreme Court case that talked about how much authority the SEC has in kind of laying out its own interpretation of things if Congress wasn't very explicit about the grant of authority. And so I think Congress is going to have to be very explicit about the bounds and metes of what it is they are empowering agencies to go out and do as far as creating the specific rules and regulations to carry out the directive and the authorities that Congress wants to see in whatever future legislation looks like. But I think a lot more explicitness, a lot more court scrutiny. And I mean, while it is, I think, good currently for folks who have resisted the kind of regulatory state to have a little more freedom of movement from the courts, I think it also is just going to increase the frequency and cadence of challenges of whatever rule sets we get. And so it's going to be a complicating factor as much as it's going to be a liberating factor potentially.
Yeah, I agree with that. Alex, I've been pitching questions to both Manfred and David. You'll be getting the kind of the tail end chiming in, so I got one directly for you. And going along the same kind of theme that we're working on here, obviously we're in a regulation, crypto regulation webinar, but with the global sanctions. So I'm going to ask this question right here. How can crypto businesses effectively manage compliance with the evolving global sanction frameworks? What tools and strategies are most effective? I mean, this is right down your alley. This is what you're doing every day. What tools are most effective in detecting and preventing sanctions evasion via cryptocurrencies? I mean, the world is kind of like a hot box of a mess right now. Sanction evasion is a top thing. Everyone's thinking about it, right? You don't want to be that exchange that's getting all these sanction transactions coming in. So, what do you think? How do you think that people can protect themselves, or exchanges can be protective?
Yeah, no, sanctions in the crypto space has been extremely dynamic, especially over the period of 2024. I think we've seen some very interesting implementations, and transparently, it's an extremely challenging space for any cryptocurrency business, regardless of size, given not only its dynamic nature, but also the pseudonymous nature of crypto transactions, where we can trace from address to address. However, understanding and being confident in the entity behind an address can be extremely difficult, especially given the fact that new blockchain addresses are being added every day. That real-time intelligence, I think, is really the greatest challenge. And so crypto businesses should not only invest in private tools like Merkle, but also look to build in-house tools as well that can really supplement those toolings. I think we're going from the point where maybe in 2018, 2019, 2020, when, the really red tech space started in crypto, to just relying on exposure analysis. Yep, you just integrate a vendor, you're good to go. I think we're really going from that perspective to saying that's not good enough anymore. You need additional steps now. You need risk scoring, you need real-time analysis, you need automated parameters, right? When it comes to not only a customer base, but also forensic attribution of crypto addresses, there's really hundreds, if not thousands, of parameters that you can build into an automated risk score that you can then build a model off of in terms of what you want to reject, what you want to accept. And again, I think indirect exposure is a huge part of that analysis, where oftentimes, sure, you might not have that direct identification that you're really 100% sure of, but I think in the cryptocurrency analysis space, you're never going to get that 100% certainty. So a risk-based approach to any compliance program, I think, is key, especially when we're talking about sanctions evasion.
Yeah. Gentlemen, David, Manfred, want to take a shot at that? Anything you want to add to that?
Well, from my perspective, completely agree with Alex there. Definitely a market that's evolving very quickly in terms of, it used to be, if this address is sanctioned, that's the only address you have to worry about. That was the original. OFAC would issue a sanctioned address. Okay, well, let's put it in a blacklist, and then now, if it hits, we'll deal with it. Now it's everything and anything, and of course, now the recent rulings in Defi and Tornado. What's this next one? What's it going to look like? Especially now we're talking non-custodials and all this other things that, again, we're in that we don't know. Tell us how we should handle this, because I feel like at this point, OFAC's seen enough reports and they know what they want to see. They know what they want to do. There's enough blocked property out there right now in crypto that it's probably becoming a problem for them as well to handle it to a certain extent. and inquiries, and how do you handle that? I know, Robert, you and I, we briefly spoke last week. It's very indirect, some percentage, right? How do
Yeah.
you really know? What can you assume, and how can you explain your decision? And that goes back to Alex's point, like your risk scoring, how on a sizable scale through LLMs and everything else, you can actually start building those models that will get you that answer faster, because at the Binance level, you have a lot of work that you need to make happen fast. In a smaller company, you might not get as many exposures, and you can actually still go through those older manual processes and go step by step, analyze the blockchain, and see if it's the originator or not. But I often draw the parallels to cash when I think about DeFi crypto. It's like, if a person comes in with $500 to buy your bike, you take the $500, you're not too worried about it. If you're selling your boat for 50 grand, you don't want to get that 50 grand stuck somewhere. So there are various things that we can even apply from traditional finance in terms of when we take certain actions, when we kind of play it by ear. Tax laws also have thresholds for a reason, because there's just, it's just too hard to get to the very granular. But in the sanctions world, 50 cents can get you in millions of dollars of trouble. So it's a dynamic place to be.
Yeah, yeah. Listening, if you ever get a chance to go listen to someone from OFAC talk about sanctions and responsibilities of exchanges and financial institutions in general, and then top that off with individual responsibility, you walk out of there kind of thinking, "Man, I could be in trouble any second now." You just never know. I mean, it's definitely an eye opener to listen to someone from OFAC talk. David, something for you, sir?
Yeah, just quickly to pop in, sanctions wasn't a primary area of focus for me at the SEC, but active in crypto and talking to lots of people. I was at an event last week where there were Treasury officials who were openly acknowledging that compliance at major crypto entities are trying to do the right thing. They're investing resources. They're really trying to get it right, and they need more guidance. But at the same time, there are challenges on Treasury side and OFAC side as to how to give that guidance. Like you say, you only have to look 5 hops deep. Now you're just given a roadmap to bad actors to just add some additional hops, and they're free and clear. So it's a lot of cat and mouse. It's a lot of complications, but I do think it's important as a former government employee to recognize that the large majority are trying to get it right and are looking for guidance and looking for suggestions about how to do so. And it's challenging for government to provide that guidance in a safe way, but ultimately I think that's the best path to try and get people to be on the same page in this area.
Yeah, data is becoming more and more important. Back to Alex's point earlier, when back in around 2016, 17, 18, these tools were just coming up, and they were kind of just pointing arrows, right? Like, you have an address, this is what it goes to, and we think this person owns it, or that entity owns it, and we think this about it. Now we're starting to see, larger companies, Binance, probably Paxful as well, and some others, tons of others out there saying, we don't really need you pointing arrows. We need the data. We need the data for our own in-house tools, because we build our own risk and we build our own tolerance levels. And just give us the data, guys. And then they rely on data. So, we try our best to get the data right every time. I'm sure sometimes we don't. I think that's just the law of averages. But I'm sure other companies like ours around the world are trying very hard to get the data as quick as possible and get it to you. So this is going to be a data war when it comes down to it. And picking your vendors is very important in this space. So I have another question along with sanctions for Alex. Manfred, you could probably jump on this since you guys are obviously into transaction monitoring daily. As sanctions evolve, we've talked about that. We see more sophisticated tactics going on, and let's just go back to the data, right? So tactics on how to get around these being labeled as sanctioned. So what are some of the tactics that you're seeing now out there from sanctioned entities? And we have platforms like Arantex. They change their hot wallets every day, right, to avoid transactions. We're doing a pretty good job picking them up as fast as they can do it, but still, it's like a daily grind. And how do you manage these challenges within your groups? I mean, you both have huge compliance groups, I'm sure. What are you telling your teams out there about sanctions and the changing and the tactics and what you're going to do as things move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Certainly a challenge, I think, like I said before, in a pseudonymous space where new cryptocurrency addresses are popping up every day. And many times when they're first initiated the blockchain, there's no intelligence, right? There's been no transactions to the address. If it's the first transaction, oftentimes it can be extremely challenging to identify what risks may exist. So I think a few parameters are really important for any compliance program. The first one is going to be real-time screening that looks at things beyond just exposure. It's not 2020 anymore. We're in a more advanced space now. You need to use additional parameters to risk score your transactions that aren't just exposure based, right? So looking at the behavior of your customer, the risk score of your customer to really feed into that transaction monitoring flow to then give you a result, whether that's a rejected transaction, an investigation or otherwise. And the other aspect is going to be ongoing monitoring. You can't just do real-time transaction screening and expect that to really address all the ongoing risks when it comes to the crypto space, especially given the dynamic nature of addresses and service addresses, like you pointed out. The risk of an address can increase significantly over even the period of a week, for example. And being able to be notified of that on a regular basis, whether that's 30 days down the road, 90 days down the road, that's also an essential part of a compliance program to be able to, again, take action on customers where necessary and mitigate that risk for your institution. Ultimately, like you said, data is king here. Having access to that data, but also using that data to build your own in-house tools and not just relying on your external vendors to give you the result. Understand how the blockchain works, understand as well, to your own degree, the heuristics that these, platforms may be utilizing, investing in your own human intelligence solutions to be able to do that proactive work in addition to the work that your vendors are doing really leads to a strong compliance program.
Interesting. Yeah, I think you're nailing it. Well, of course you are. You're doing it every day. So keep up the good work. Manfred, what are you telling your teams over there? How are you guys prepared for this?
So completely same evolution of everything, right? You pre-2020, you probably, if you were just crypto, you were just dealing with, you're looking at your exposure and that's your Bible. Once you started adding on-ramps, off-ramps, you plugged in something to monitor that. And then over the last 4 years, blending the two together. You got your on-ramp, off-ramp, crypto to crypto, peer-to-peer internally, then crypto to external, like all of a sudden you have, just if you have 7 types of transactions within the company, in between them, you can already create nice money laundering schemes without even ever leaving, the ecosystem. And then, it comes in, it does its thing, it comes out, it looks completely different. Because, there are definitely walls with centralized exchanges that are there, right? That you can't see past even with the providers. So lots, we've kind of deviated a little bit from sanctions, but at the same time, there are typologies for sanctions avoidance that you see through general transaction monitoring. So it's not just going to be your sanctioned exchange part that will drive you to that alert to the case, to possible report and investigation. So those things are constantly evolving. Better tools, whether you build them in-house or you buy them and then you blend them together. Over time, there are literal vendors out there that they're like, oh, we'll take all your vendors and give you another layer, right, of information on all of your intelligence, and then just pay us the money. So you're trying to do that. At the end of the day, we're in a compliance talk here. Any decision that you make on real time, any blocking that you implement, sanctions has forever been, you're at a 0.0% of true match, right? A little less on the blockchain because those exposures are pretty clear. But like, let's say just onboarding a customer, and then we'll talk about KYC, I think, here later and everything else. But when you're onboarding customers, you're running them through the lists, and that has been, historically super inefficient for a very long time. And you're hitting good people with long onboarding processes just because their name matches. I just read yesterday that they added a very common name to the sanctions list, and then they're like, oh, I feel sorry for all the John Smiths out there. But it's that to some extent, because that's another challenge for compliance is how do you do the right thing at a scale without strangling the business and strangling the entire other side of things, because there's a business end to it too, and that's why I feel like historically fraud, for example, has always taken a little bit of a separate side to compliance, because compliance has, you know, definite rules where fraud has like a bottom line to the business more. So business controls maybe more of the fraud end, while compliance has its thing. But of course, you know, consumer protection through fraud then blends the two. But lots of things that we can do, lots of things that we're doing, but at the same time evolving beyond just that straightforward approach with the one rule to one activity, but, you know, really looking at all your data together, the device, the fingerprints, the locations, the geo aspect. Oh, and you know, we can probably have a whole chat just about this, I'm sure. Maybe for next.
Yeah. You know, that spurs a thought real quick. I obviously I talked to a lot of law enforcement officers, state and locals from around the world, and we discuss a lot about what agencies or what they should ask for from an exchange. For instance, they want to send a subpoena over to Binance or maybe Paxful or whatever. And they say, what should we ask them? I said, well, don't think of crypto at the exchange level as just an address and a transaction they're looking at. These companies have built very effective compliance tools from the ground up, essentially, to deal with crypto. Make sure you're asking for the really good stuff. You know, the IP address, how many devices are logged in, what's their fingerprints look like, who owns, not only who owns it, but how many people are accessing it, different IPs, right? So you could have one account and 5 people accessing it. You know, you want to get all that information. So trying to get law enforcement to understand this in a much broader picture, and a lot of them get it very quickly, so it's not a big deal. But you know, that initial talk, like this is what you need to be looking for, because this is a whole totality of the circumstances approach to compliance. You know, and hats off to the crypto industry for building these tools really from ground up. So yeah, one thing I have noticed is it's very relevant to what's going on, and crypto industry has really balanced the effective compliance. I want to use the word effective compliance, along with still being a money making or a profitable business model at the same time, because sometimes those two blend and they don't blend too well. Depending on what the business model is. So hats off to that. David, you want to take a quick shot at what we were just talking about, or you want to move on to something else?
Yeah, we can move on, other than just wanted to quickly say, like, both Alex and Manfred's contribution sounded exactly like what you'd want to hear from a regulatory perspective of thinking creatively, looking expansively, using data effectively. Like, that's exactly what regulators are hoping is going to happen. And I think, to your point, Robert, that has certainly made the investigative process easier for regulators who know how to ask for the right data. I remember early, like 2015, 2016, when I got involved in crypto, didn't really have analytics, and it was really kind of shooting in the dark, just talking to exchanges. Have you seen anybody who's been involved in this wallet address or this transaction? And then as the kind of analytics got better, you could ask more sophisticated questions, mostly transaction and KYC based. But as the kind of analysis internally becomes more sophisticated, I think that creates closer and better partnerships with law enforcement, because there are some shared goals there about trying to keep fraud out of the networks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to move on. David, I'm going to shoot this to you, and this is going to be off the topic. We're not talking about sanctions anymore. We're going to move on to another question here about DAOs. Recently, there's a ruling determined that DAOs can be treated as partnerships under California law. Additionally, there have been cases where developers are held accountable as responsible persons for compliance deficiencies. Do you anticipate increased scrutiny around DeFi and DAOs? And how do you see these platforms or protocols adopting compliance by measures? And I remember, well, it was not that long ago, of course I remember, when DeFi was really just becoming a thing. Like, this is the new word of the day: DeFi, smart contracts. We had DAOs out there, of course, at the time, or beginning. Of course, we had the DAO hack, so that's like the first time people actually started thinking about this. You know, you at that time, you heard it was almost like the ICO, like the rush to the ICOs days, but you heard people saying, oh, it's a smart contract, no one owns it. You know, I'm not responsible for it. I launched it. It's I put it out there, but I'm not responsible for it. It's a smart contract. I don't think we're there anymore. I think we've kind of changed gears now in the whole world. But what do you think this new ruling in California is going to set us up for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, especially if you look at it in conjunction with the Fifth Circuit decision that was out last week regarding Tornado Cash. And that court came to the conclusion that immutable smart contracts aren't property and no one really owns them. I don't know that it goes all the distance to saying no one is accountable for the conduct of what happens on those smart contracts. I don't know that the court went all the way down that analysis and didn't need to reach its finding about OFAC applicability and particular enabling statute at issue there. But it suggests at least the possibility that people who are transacting on immutable smart contracts can do so with a higher degree of freedom and with a lower regulatory overhang. But then you look at the California decision, it seems like it comes out exactly the opposite way, that if you're involved in a DAO and you're making effectively voting decisions, you're now an active participant in a partnership and can be held accountable under kind of existing partnership law in the US for all of the actions of that partnership, which is a huge amount of liability. I'm sure more than most people think they are undertaking when they make a vote on a particular DAO governance proposal or otherwise active in a DAO. I think we'll need more clarity around it. I think court-based law here is going to be challenging if that's the only framework we have to work from. I think it would be helpful to have some more guidance about where DeFi is going. I think there's both on the innovation side a need for some laxity and some freedom of movement to allow innovation to occur, but from an investor protection and market integrity perspective, that's all based on the ideas that somebody is going to be accountable and that there's some way to apply effective and meaningful oversight to ensure more predictable outcomes. I can't think of an example prior to crypto, at least, of a long-standing, low accountability financial system. Those tend to fall under their own weight because people will take advantage. And so how you both inject accountability, but also allow for the fact that some of these things aren't really owned by anyone. They're just somebody set them up and can walk away and they'll continue to operate in perpetuity. It raises some unique and novel challenges, and very interested to see how they get played out. But hopefully it'll be a legislative rather than a court-driven initial solution.
Yeah, that kind of seems like a little bit of a rabbit hole, right? Two opposing court decisions. They're not directly opposing, but they interact with each other, and one creates a problem for the other, back and forth. And how is compliance going to evolve around those two rulings to be substantive, right, going forward? So it's going to be interesting how it plays out. Manfred, do you have comments on that? What do you think about that? No, good.
Yeah,
Alex?
not on that one.
No. Okay, good. How about you, Alex? Anything to add?
I think David said it exactly right. As always, regulation does tend to trend well for the space, that clarity is good. In this case, I'm not sure if clarity is there as of yet. That still remains to be seen. But I think in terms of DeFi eating the industry, I think it's very interesting where we're starting to see some more guidance come out regarding decentralized finance. It's certainly there for centralized exchanges and we're getting there. But I think decentralized exchanges and that entire world is still very open in terms of the regulatory space. And so I think, it now being front and center in court cases in the legal realm, is only the first step to now going to regulation.
Yeah. So you all remember back when ICO was the thing, right? Like the ICOs were coming out, and we had this huge run up of ICOs. And I went to the Bitcoin conference in Miami. I think it was 2018. Everyone was pitching an ICO. Like every 2 seconds, there was some guy on the stage pitching his new ICO, and I'm like, who really needs that? No one needs that. I know the blockchains, and then we saw the DeFi run up, and we saw enforcement actions like hit them both, right? And then now we see stablecoins doing the same, and we're going to see this new rulings kind of do the same. So we're going to see all these peaks, and every one of them is going to have to fall in line with their own type of regulation as it happens. I think as it falls, we'll see the regulation come in. So
I think as always, full circle right back to the beginning when we started this webinar. When something goes wrong, that's when they start paying attention.
That's when it goes back, right? It goes back to the circle, right?
Until everyone's doing fine in ICOs and DeFi, nobody cares. Until people start losing money, then they start complaining. Then people's representatives and government come knocking.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you, if you're an upcoming attorney, this is probably a good space to get into because there's going to be a lot of work over here, regardless of what side you're on. It doesn't matter. It's going to be a lot of work. Alex, I'm going to pick on you for a second. Since you're kind of the transaction monitoring guy here, and Binance, we know has a ton of transactions. So the question for you is, are you observing any emerging risk, new patterns or typologies? Basically just tell us how your job's going. What do you see the market doing? Whatever you can share. I'm sure Binance is not going to share everything. So we're fully aware of that. So just if you can answer that question. And then how do you detect them? Like you're sitting behind your desk, you got your teams out there working, you're observing something, how are you observing that? What's how are they coming in, and what do you see it going, and how's your team, detecting them and working against them, and just trying to keep the market safe?
Yeah, really great question. I think a ton of emerging risks, especially with the explosion in the market as of late. Unfortunately and naturally, whenever there's exciting new technology or exciting new market movements, that is unfortunately a space where criminals can take advantage. And what I'm specifically talking about is romance fraud, address poisoning. We've seen these really interesting new typologies where it's kind of an evolution of phishing, right? We have all those old emails where, click on this link or click on this attachment, and we're really going, way beyond those initial scams, which we all view as potentially quite basic. We never fall for that. And now we're moving to way more advanced scams, things like address poisoning, where now you essentially have to verify every single step of your transaction yourself. You read every single character in your address to make sure you're not going to fall victim to something. And I think, that is a space that is not only ripe for evolution, but also a space where not only exchanges, but also technology providers can really fit that mold, whether that's real-time address screening or having security companies, screen addresses and smart contracts to understand what their fraud risks are, I think is also a space that I've seen a ton of vendors grow into, which is really exciting. So the sad part is that whenever there's an explosion in technology, criminals take advantage of that. But I think the uplifting part is that technology vendors like Merkle and others in the space, are right there to address that risk and really give their customers the answers they need in terms of that real-time transaction screening. So I think fraud is a huge part of that. And unfortunately, terrorism financing, I think this year has been something that we've seen an explosion in. And so any program, I think, needs to be extremely proactive about that type of risk. You can't just simply rely on law enforcement, regulators, or even to a certain degree, your vendors to be able to effectively identify that for you. You need to, one, hire the talent in order to identify this, whether that's former law enforcement, compliance professionals, the experts in the space, to be able to proactively investigate and identify those risks for you, but also investing in the right technology, right? Whether that's building things in-house or investing in leading tools in the industry, and not relying on just one vendor, right? Really spacing out your costs to be able to cover multiple different risks. I think every single vendor does a lot of things great, and not necessarily all the time do they overlap. Every vendor has its strength. And so that's ultimately the advantage of having a multi-vendor solution or working with many different technology providers, is you can utilize the best of each.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Yeah, the world's changing, and it seems like you just remove the dollar or whatever fiat currency and put in crypto, and that's the new scam of the day. And the scams, to some of us, since we've been in the market, we understand that it's kind of a basic fraud. How didn't we see that coming? But there's some vulnerable people in our world. We all know that, and this happens, and I feel for them. I really do. And these groups out there are vicious in how they attack some of the customers and make victims of them. So, yeah, thank you for that answer, Alex. Manfred, David, either you want to take a crack at that? We got about 7 minutes before I want to go for questions. So, if you want to take a crack at that, I think we have time for one more question. So, go ahead.
Sure. So to second that, I think, anyone who's been here from the beginning of the hour can see the theme: data, tools, risk assessment, right?
Yeah.
Risk assessment can be very simple, as in like, oh, what country they're from, because that's maybe the only thing you know up front. Then their name, you can screen through some lists. Those are 2 data points. Over time, transactions, interactions, everything else, how you put it all together, and you identify things. To second on the elements of fraud, going back to my Western Union days, there were people who are always willing to part with their money for a romance. And, they were actively angry with compliance teams blocking them. They're like, I don't care. This is a scam. I don't care. I get something out of this. I will continue sending money. I'll not through you. I'll go to, Binance, Coinbase. I'll find a way to continue this. And, you can't always protect people from themselves, but it's our job to try. and like, again, going back, risk assess transactions, risk assess customers, risk assess the 2 together. You have histories, you have past behaviors. The tools themselves are evolving to give you that without you having to investigate further. Like, oh, this rule is a little bit better. It's hitting at, 20%, whereas these rules are at 3%. false positive, and grow that together. I consult every once in a while a startup in the space. You're like, what are you looking for? I'm like, I'm looking for rules that learn without me teaching them, and that's the great space right now with AI and those things. And then, you have drop-offs when you can't explain it anymore and it starts hallucinating and everything else. There are multiple industries that are evolving simultaneously that can really, once we find that nexus, can really take off and help us do things faster, because speed is very important a lot of times in compliance process.
Speed. That's what I tell everyone. It's all about speed. How fast can you realize the victim's been victimized? How fast can you get word to the exchange, and how fast is cooperation started? Those are probably well, from an investigator's point of view, that's probably the most important thing out there, is how fast that everyone realizes there's a problem and there's been something done somewhere to try to effect a stoppage of it. Like let's stop this right now. So yeah, recognize the problem. David, I'll tell you what, we have about 9 minutes left. I'd like to get some of these questions on the chat board here, but I see one that I think is probably good for you. If it's not, we can pass it around. But it's from Mohinder Bara. I hope I got that right. So it says, "Hey guys, how do you balance emerging crypto risk against emerging data privacy regulations? Do you have a process you follow to be successful?" And then he says, "Thank you." This is a big deal because data providers like Merkle, we fit in one box, right? We try to keep the PII out of it because it opens up a whole new box for us, right? It's like popping the top on a new can. But sooner or later, I think that's where the data is going to have to go. And you guys are already doing it. You guys are already adding PII to transactions. So how do you think these new data privacy laws, as they come about, we got GDPR in the EU. I'm sure the US is going to see more, Australia, we're going to see more data privacy come around. How do you think this is going to affect the market? I don't know. Do we have Dave here still?
Yeah,
There he
I'm
is.
here. So if that was
Oh.
for me. So
Yeah, sorry.
Absolutely. Apologies. It'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. Like the US does not have, as Europe does, comprehensive privacy protections. I think in Europe it's constitutional, and here it's considered in legislation, but I think very little of that has been adopted at the federal level. There is state level privacy protections, and I think we'll probably see more of that over the next couple of years. I don't think that's going to make anybody's compliance life easier. It's hard enough when you're dealing with just federal regulators, but then when you have a patchwork of states, as we do with the money transmitter licenses, like that increases complexity exponentially. And so the more things can be federalized and then adopted at the state level, I think harmonizing within the US is really important. Harmonizing internationally is really important, trying to make these principles based and streamlined and cooperative. And I think, we're seeing a confluence of a bunch of things, not just AI and crypto, but also I think cybersecurity, as exchanges are stores of huge quantities of PII and valuable data, and ultimately potentially control over assets that can be easily and quickly converted irrevocably. Like there is going to be an arms race, I expect, with cyber to try and figure out how you segment your data, how you keep it protected, and how you are kind of real-time aware of what it is you're doing. At the same time that these exchanges are also, and intermediaries are transacting data all the time, and I would not be surprised to see some of those transactions start to become more challenging as people think of ways to embed data that's problematic in transactions that might look normal.
Yeah. Manfred, sir?
From my perspective here, compliance, fortunately, through the AML and BSA equivalents, we have access to data. So at least the data that we have, we can at least work with. Of course, GDPR does make you think about things in terms of like who sees what. Does this analyst need to see this data piece? Does marketing need to see this? It helps you compartmentalize what you want to do where. As far as it relates to emerging crypto risks and whatnot, travel rule, I feel like it's a bad word in crypto almost. It's something that everybody has to now do pretty much. US, Singapore, leading the way, Europe. But that's one way we're adding PII to crypto. The trust version, the Nota Bene version of it, different versions that try to add elements to track crypto across exchanges, to actually track, not just track crypto, now track people across the things like that. When people have asked me, like, what's the most exciting thing that could happen to compliance? A universal ID standard. Hey, what if blockchain does something like, I can't see that because, not even Europe has established that, like, hey, here's your universal European ID. That's you on the internet. It's verified. You can just, is it a fingerprint? Is it there are various versions of it, but how can I identify myself in the world? And that, with privacy still in mind, somebody who solves that is the next, billionaire out there, I think, because it applies to everything today. And that's how do you blend that? Still be private, but still be known to who needs to know, in the compliance, banking, financial, for example, like one of the privacy questions that has come up, your IP address, is that PII? I've heard arguments both ways to the same thing. Is like, my wallet address, is that now PII, right? Is because as soon as you tie it to me, is that PII, but it's public, but it's not. But like public IP, public address, many ways it can go.
Well, going on the IP thing real quick, and I'll get to you, Alex. So you haven't got off the hook, Alex. I'm still coming to you. Talking about the IP address in the U.S., we used to be able to just ask the phone companies for the cell tower records, but now that takes a search warrant to get that information. So I can see it's not too much of a stretch in the United States to say your IP is a personal property, and it takes a search warrant to get it. So very interesting thought, Manfred. That's going to resonate right there. That's coming. And I think the ID issue, that is a cryptological problem waiting to be solved right there. I think cryptography and crypto itself can solve that problem one day. Alex, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think to hit the nail on the head, Robert, like you said, technology, I think, is shifting a lot, where it introduces a lot of brand new questions that potentially we had never had to consider before. And while data privacy certainly isn't my bread and butter when it comes to my day-to-day, I think it's at the forefront of every single compliance leader's work, restricting data, who has access to data, to Manfred's point. I think what's really, really interesting is, at least the way it feels in the industry, is that cryptocurrency exchanges and VASPs in general almost have like a greater standard to meet when it comes to data privacy. And that's just because of cybersecurity. Like David was saying earlier, I think because of all the huge headlines in the space when it comes to hacks, stolen funds, there's an expectation that if you're using a cryptocurrency exchange, they're going to have the best cybersecurity in the business because of all the threat vectors and risks that there are out there. And it's not just for your assets, but also for your customers' data as well. They both fall into that same realm of, cybersecurity, ensuring your practices are strong and that you're taking every single precaution to ensure there's no exterior breaches. So I think expectations, honestly, are higher than they've ever been, not only from a regulatory perspective, but just an industry perspective as to what's expected when you're a customer.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, data and privacy, those two things have been the age old, or since the internet popped up, right? Kind of the thorn in the side. So this discussion is not over yet. It's going to be a long way down the road. We have a lot of I think a lot of very fascinating and sometimes good and bad things are yet to come in the crypto world. So, gentlemen, it is 7:59. We're at 59 minutes. I appreciate everyone on this call. I appreciate the panelists here. Thank you all for showing up. Very enlightening. 3 professionals in the field. I wish we could give a round of applause, but no one will hear it. But thank you all, gentlemen. It's been great. This recording will be available if you want to hear it later. Please hit us up at Merkle, and we'll send you a link. And I think this will be posted on our website as well. So, gentlemen, thank you for participating. It's been a lively conversation, very informative, and have a great day. Let's put it that way. We'll try to get around the world wherever you are.
Thanks so much,
thank you very
Robert.
much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.